Well, when I arrived today, they picked me up at the airport, and the people, my colleagues were asking me, they said, Jim, are you going to be sad or are you going to cry? I was like, why would I cry? What's there to cry about? This is a wonderful celebration. It's 20 years. I'm so happy. And I didn't understand. And then I got here, and they gave me this beautiful pin. I got to show it to you. This beautiful pin. And I realized that this might be my going away party, that they're retiring me. Well done, Sir Jim. I mean, that was perfect. If you watch the show Succession, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. So 20 years, so what does it mean? So my kid said it means that I'm old, but it really gave me a chance to reflect back and think about the history of the firm and some of the past events. And the reality is, 20 years ago, we didn't have 20-year planning, we didn't do 10-year planning, we didn't do 5-year planning, and we didn't do 1-year planning. Our life was very much about survival. And it's the old story of the animals in Africa that every day the gazelle wakes up and knows that it has to be faster than the slowest lion or it gets eaten by the fastest lion. And the lion wakes up and the same thing. But really our existence was survival, and nothing's changed. It really strikes me that when I think about the firm, we wake up as a hungry firm. We wake up as a firm that's out trying to grow, trying to build, and it really is about survival still. Nothing's really changed. So the firm has my name on the door, and I should give you a little bit of history about that. There's a story there, and the story is that I was out power washing my deck contemplating life, and I got a call from the CEO of a New York Stock Exchange company, and he said, hey Jim, he said, I want to talk to you about a deal. And I said, hey Ricky, I said, I got out of the business. I'm no longer in the business. He said, Jim, I don't want to hire a firm, I want to hire you. And I said, oh, business plan. I said, when can I come see you? And I went and saw him, and we went and sat down. I said, what are you looking to do? And he told me. And he said, how much do you charge me? And I quoted him a fee. And he said, okay, we have a deal. And at that point I realized I'd been taught, you never talk past the sale. So I was thinking to myself, how do I get out of here as quickly as possible without messing this up? So I tried to keep my mouth closed from then on, get out of the meeting, and get out of the office. But when I did that, there was no company. There was no Seale and Associates. There was no tax ID. There was no corporate form. And so I got on the plane and I flew home. It was Jim Seale. And I called Brett. And I said, hey, Brett. I said, you're never going to believe this, but there's this company that wants to hire me to help them in the investment banking business. And as the story goes, Brett was young and dumb enough at the time that he said, sure, why not? I have to do this. What could be better than working with some guy? And it wasn't even my basement. My basement wasn't finished. It was working with someone in the living room of his house. And he came over. So the history and the legacy of the name were that we didn't have time for imaginative names and creative names. So it was basically jump online and it was Seale and Associates. S-E-A-L-E and Associates. Why not? That seemed like a great idea. And Brett came up with the logos and all that, and as a matter of principle, 20 years later, we refused to change them because we didn't waste a lot of time on things like that. We were focused on client service, we were focused on getting our deal done and serving the firm. But the significance of that, the reason I tell you this story is that earlier in my career I worked at a firm called Arthur Andersen. And many people who are old enough in this room may remember that Arthur Andersen was at one time the biggest professional services firm in the world. It did audit work, tax work, all kinds of work on a global basis. And that's where I was trained in my early years of my career. And what many people didn't know is that Arthur Andersen was actually a person. Arthur Andersen was trained at Price Waterhouse, and Arthur Andersen went and started his own firm. And it was sort of marginally successful during his lifetime. But after he was gone, the firm became far more successful than when Arthur Andersen was alive. And I used to think a lot about that when I worked at Arthur Andersen, and sometimes I think about that now, but it gives me an opportunity to talk about what I think of are the founding principles of our firm. And these were always pretty important to me because they're things that I cared about greatly, and I still care about today. And the very first thing that comes to mind when I think about our firm and who we are is integrity. And integrity is a funny word. You know, people run around this world and they say, oh, we have high integrity, we have high integrity, and they say it. But it's one thing to say it, and it's another thing to live it, and live it every day. And we've done that. And when I tell you we've done that, I'll give you an example. We've made mistakes. I know, it's hard to believe. Nobody in this world will ever admit making mistakes. But we've made mistakes, and I learned very early on that the best way to overcome a mistake is to go and say, hey client, we messed up. I'm sorry, but here's what we're going to do to fix it. And to acknowledge your mistake. It's an easier way to live your life. It's an easier way to build your business. And that is, to me, one of our founding principles of the firm was integrity. Second, there's only three. The second founding principle of our firm, I will tell you, is hire smart people. And if you're around any of the people I work with, especially Brett, they'll tell you how much smarter they are than I am. They tell me on a daily basis. And I've come to believe it. They're all smarter than I am. And that's a good thing, right? It used to be a little bit challenging, but then I realized we should always be hiring smarter people, because as you hire smarter people, great things are going to happen. And we've certainly done that. And so I sort of think of leadership of a firm, it's sort of like raising a family, right? You have your children, and on the one hand, you try to nurture your children, but on the other hand, you don't want to suffocate your children. And that's sort of the principle I've taken, because, you know, I go back to the story I told you about the name. I never wanted it to be about Jim Seale. Jim Seale and Associates will only last as long as I'm here. There's an opportunity for us to last a very long time. And finally, the third founding principle of the firm that I would tell you is get lucky. I feel like I'm the luckiest person in the world. I feel like I've been in the right spot at the right time. I feel like luck happens with hard work. But let me tell you some of the ways that I've been lucky in my lifetime. Meeting Brett Carmel. Probably the luckiest thing that ever happened in my life. Brett came to me as a young fellow who didn't know anything, but he was eager. And Brett is now, you hear all the testimonies. Brett's leading advisor, incredible respect, very knowledgeable, and there's no question he's smarter than I am. Rob Whitney. I'm lucky to have met Rob Whitney. We hired Rob out of Deloitte. We poached him out many years ago. And Rob, he now runs around and he tells me every day how much smarter he is than I am, and that's true as well. Sergio. Sergio we hired as a young Mexican kid. Actually, he wasn't the first, but I'll tell you about that in a second. We hired Sergio. He came to Washington, worked, and then Sergio said, you know, our clients are in Mexico, and wouldn't it make a lot of sense for us to be in Mexico? I was like, wow, that is really smart. I knew you were smarter than I was. And Sergio opened an office in Mexico City, and you're going to get to meet some of the younger people we have, but they've been incredibly successful. Carlos. I'm lucky to have met Carlos. Worked with Carlos for a number of years. Carlos and I have done a number of deals together. I'm very lucky. Adon Sierra. Very lucky to have met you, Adon. I'm very lucky to have you as a colleague. But it doesn't end there. Jeremy Rowan. We're very lucky to have met Jeremy. And Adrian Morena came in to see us tonight. We were very lucky. Adrian was our first Mexican employee, and he'll tell you some of the stories. You should ask him when he first came to work for us. We put him up in some dorm in Georgetown that he was a terrified person, and I went to Target and I bought him pillows, and he looked all terrified as I dropped him off. But then after the first weekend of parties, he came in and I said, "How's it going?" He's like, "I love it here." He's like, "It's awesome." I'm very lucky to have known Adrian. And maybe most important is Felipe. Felipe, when my colleagues and my friends back home ask me how we're in Mexico, I'm going to tell you everybody a little story about that. It has a lot to do with you. In fact, it almost has everything to do with you. And we are so lucky to know you and your family and your children and your wife. And we've loved going to the weddings over the years and getting to know the family. But the Felipe Bueno family, I mean, everybody in here's family. I figured that out, right? Everybody we've ever worked with is family. But that's very lucky. I feel very lucky about that as well. So when I talk about looking back, feel lucky about the people. We've been lucky to have great clients. I'm going to tell you one more story and then I'll be quick. People wanted to know how we ended up in Mexico. Well, after we started the firm, Brett and I were off on a marketing visit up to a company called American Standard in Piscataway, New Jersey. And I'd gone up to the meeting and we drove up in a car. We didn't have enough money to fly up or take the train. We were driving up a beat up old car to get there, starting our business venture. And I go into this meeting and I make this presentation to a fellow by the name of Pete DeLoy, at the time who was the CFO. And before we go into the meeting, I had a meatball Parmesan sandwich and I was in a food coma. So I marbled my way through the meeting, I didn't talk there. And we left the meeting and I still remember we get in the car, Brett says, "You messed that up. That was the worst ever. You talked like an idiot. That was horrible." And I was like, "All right." I was like, "You're pissing me off." I said, "Give me the phone." I said, "We're going to call him right now." And I called Pete back and I said, "Pete, normally I don't talk with marbles in my mouth, but I had a meatball Parmesan sub, and don't judge us by that. You have to hire us." And he said, "Okay." And the significance is he hired us to sell business in Mexico. So you want to know how we came down to Mexico? We came down to Mexico because the meeting that Brett so forcefully came at me, we got hired to sell the water heater business down in Mexico, and we sold this business to Grupo Industrial Saltillo. That's our first deal in Mexico. And at the end of the deal, we get a call from Felipe Bueno, who was working at Grupo Industrial Saltillo, and he said, "You know, Jim, you did a really good job for your client. We want you to come market to us at Grupo Industrial Saltillo." And I looked over at Brett and I said, we only had maybe 2 clients at the time. I said, "Can we have a Mexican client?" Brett's like, "Why can't we? I guess we can, right? We're trying to figure this out." So then I said, "Felipe, can you pay us in dollars?" He's like, "Of course we can pay you in dollars. Are you stupid?" And I'm like, "Yes, I mean, yes, we're naive, we're stupid." But the significance is we came down, we made a marketing visit to Grupo Industrial Saltillo, and we did 4 or 5 deals for Industrials in Grupo Industrial Saltillo. And that unlocked a network. And next thing you know, we're hiring kids out of Mexico, we're bringing them to the States, we're training them in the States. And then very shortly thereafter, we're hiring them in Mexico. And then next thing you know, we have an office in Mexico. And next thing you know, they're giving me a pin, thanking me for my 20 years of service. 2 more stories. I have another colleague of mine, Marty Cohen. Marty is 30 years older. He was our client at Allied Signal Honeywell. And it was a few years ago that I was talking to Marty, reflecting back about the youth of our business and where we've come, or how far we've come. And I said, "You know, Marty," I said, "I really can't believe how little I knew 20 years ago." I said, "And in fact, I can't believe anybody ever hired us." I said, "It's really strange to me." I said, "It's incredible how lucky we've been." And I said, "But you know what bothers me the most?" I said, "I'm wondering if in 20 years from now, I'll look back and say, wow, I can't believe how stupid I was 20 years ago." And Marty looked over at me, very wise, and he said, "Jim," he said, "I promise you that's what you're going to think." He said, "In 20 years, you're going to look back and realize you knew even less than you thought you did now." And I always thought that was sort of interesting, and I remember that. But people ask about the future in the next 20 years and what I hope for Seale and Associates. And the reality is, I have no idea what the firm will be in 20 years. I had no idea we would be here. I had no idea we would have an office in Mexico and have all these smart people working for us. But what I do know is if you hire really smart people and you train them, eventually they are going to give me the pin, and I asked Sergio to let me stay for a few more years, but I hope that the firm continues and grows, and I hope we continue to get lucky, because that's how I think of it. Because our crowning achievement, and I've talked to Brett about this, our crowning achievement will be when the young folks who work at our firm sit around and they talk and they say, that crazy old Brett Carmel and all the crazy things that he did, and Jim, I won't look at that badly. I'll look at that with a sign of respect. I'll be very happy if that happens, because it means we will build something meaningful and something that will have lasted. It doesn't make me sad. So I know a few others want to say a few words, and I want to thank you all for the support over the last 20 years. But if I had one toast to prepare or to give you all, I would say, let's raise our glasses to staying lucky, because I feel like we're the luckiest people on the planet. So thank you very much, and we appreciate you coming.